The opinions expressed in this program are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or on any specific security. It is only intended to provide education about the financial industry. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult your financial advisor prior to investing. Any past performance discussed during this program is no guarantee of future results. Any indices referenced for comparison are unmanaged and cannot be invested into directly. Any references to performance of securities are thought to be materially accurate and actual performance may differ. As always, please remember investing involves risk and possible loss of principal capital. Please seek advice from a licensed professional.
Welcome back to another edition of the Daily Dots. Chase flying solo with you here on Wednesday, July 16th. Today was definitely eventful with one of the bigger trial balloons I think I've seen in a long time. We'll talk about that. We'll go through the markets, and then I have talk about data a tiny bit, and then two things I wanted to cover today that I think are worth talking about. We'll start with the markets, of course. Very eventful day, but the markets were not, and we're kind of in this period of the last few days before options expiration where we're probably just not going to move a whole lot. So it's not surprising that we did not move a whole lot. The S&P closed up 0.3, Q's up 0.1, IWM up 1. So you got kind of a snapback where small caps at least took some of the monster loss versus the Q's back from yesterday, and rates kind of gave up some of what they did yesterday. Equal weight was up about 0.4 with Mag 7 up about 0.25. All world ex-US up 0.4. The dollar was down 0.35. I don't think the move higher in the dollar's over yet, but it is notable during the trial balloon, which we're going to discuss, the dollar did not appreciate that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Oil was essentially flat on the day, up a tiny bit. Nat gas up decent amount, and weather for the next 2 weeks east of the Rockies, where it matters big time for gas, really hot. So the cooling demand is pretty significant here for gas, but at the same time it has to beat on some storage reports for those weeks to really get the ball rolling, I think, for price. Gold up 0.67, silver flat, platinum up another 1.5, and palladium up 3. Copper down about 1%. And yields, the 2-year down 6 basis points. I'm just going to be honest with you. I think that's dumb. I think that should be higher. But it's just one day. The 10-year was down 3, and the 30-year was essentially flat. We'll get into that more. A lot of this was Japan, which is one of the things I'm going to cover kind of at length. And also, it was worth noting, and I'll talk here about the trial balloon, that played a big role here too. So what we had was, last night a congresswoman from Florida came out and said, oh yeah, Jay Powell's going to get fired, which was interesting. I don't think anyone took it that too seriously, but it turns out that was because President Trump met with congressional Republicans last night and told them he was going to fire Jay Powell. And then this morning, a White House official essentially confirmed that. So the market started to really run with it. The way that looked was equities down a good bit, bond yields up a good bit out of the long end. You know, on the 30-year, you're up like 5-6 basis points. The dollar was down close to 1%. You had gold up about 1%. You had volatility up like 5-6-7%. So like the market obviously didn't appreciate it. And that's notable because the gambling, like the betting market odds for Trump actually firing Powell, they got up in like 30s, 40s. So it wasn't like it went to like 80-90% chance, which tells me, you know, if those markets had to go all the way to 100, the reality is, you know, that all those moves I just cited would have accelerated and gotten stronger. With that said, I mean, he even drafted, like, you know, the actual memo about it and everything. So that tells me it's still very possible he just decides to go ahead and do it. But clearly this was a trial balloon to see how the market reacted to credible reporting that it was going to happen. Maybe that was enough to spook them out of doing it. But maybe not. Maybe they end up eventually pressing forward with it. And I think part of this is the fact that I think they know the tariffs are going to create enough inflation to make it a PR problem to cut rates. You know, if we do go back up to 3%, 4% inflation, even just 3, which I mean the Fed themselves thinks we're going to do in the forecasts. And that's just, and how do you cut rates into that, especially if if unemployment's still under 5 and it's 4.1 right now. See your 4.5% unemployment and 4% or even 3% inflation. That's just not a mix to justify, especially cutting down to where President Trump wants it, like 1%. Like that, even to go to 3 or 4, like you can't really justify that. But right now with 2.7% inflation, like you can at least make a case that, hey, we should do some cutting. I think they're about to lose that air cover for that and have to get back in the trees. And I think part of this is they know that, and so there's they feel a pressure to like get some cuts now while they can. But that's all speculation on my part, so who knows? But shortly after that, President Trump came out and said, "Oh, no, like highly unlikely we do that." Kind of just threw out the just kidding. And the market all just came back to kind of where it came from. And so we went from yields being up a good bit to kind of flat to down a little bit out on the long end. That was largely driven by Japan because the Japanese long end rallied by like 10 basis points. So yields came down in Japan after having surged a little bit, earlier this week. And this is important because Japan has an election this weekend. Their upper house, their upper chamber of their system has an election. And the LDP has basically run the show for a long time, kind of almost like a one-party rule situation. Now all of a sudden they're losing ground. There's more competition. The competition seems to want, more fiscal stimulus, lower taxes, bigger deficits, which would mean more growth, more inflation, which would push yields higher, should push, interest rates higher, meaning like rate hikes. And that is kind of pressuring the whole global long end, as the Japanese bond market's sort of been a global anchor to help keep all yields down. Now all of a sudden it's unpinning itself to the upside. You're at 08 highs for yields on the 10-year in Japan, or you just were. 30 years, like as high as it's been since they kind of introduced it. So that's going to be interesting this weekend. So you could have a situation Monday where, let's say the LDP really gets smoked. You could have a situation where yields kind of globally are up 20 bips on the long end everywhere, roughly. Or you have a situation where the LDP like far outperforms what people are thinking today. And I could see it being like more of like a down 10, 15 basis point, 20 basis point day. So there's going to be some noise introduced into our bond yields here in the U.S. early next week, where you may see some people ascribing different U.S. policy things or data things to it, and it may just be, Japan. So something to think about as we go into the weekend. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and then I'll mention data at the very end, is Cloudflare. This is a bit of a lesson in a mistake. So, and me just wanting to talk about a company that I find interesting and why at the moment. This has been one of my highest conviction tech long ideas, man, for 3-4 years probably. I've liked it for a long time, and AI is just making it stronger. And the reason I say this is kind of like a lesson, is like a mistake, is we owned it here for a while, and then I think it was either in the April shakeout this time or last July, or maybe both, that I allowed myself to just go to zero on it, which is fine as long if you are like militantly watching it to get back in whenever it's the time to do that. But I wasn't. So you end up in a situation where you get out, which can make sense at times if you get into a liquidity event, to just take something you love to zero and go back and get it later. That's fine. That makes sense. But here we are. I didn't get back in, and it's had a really good performance. I think it's probably still fine to buy around here. Not at all a recommendation by any stretch, but and it's gone up a lot lately. So the risk reward is nothing like it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But it's a name we may get back into if the opportunity kind of shows itself at some point. But more to the point, forget all that. Like, why the company's gotten interesting all of a sudden, with AI doing what it's doing is about 20% of internet traffic runs through Cloudflare. Because they help all kinds of different companies with a lot of security stuff on the internet. And I'm sure most of you know, but probably not all, the way AI works is they have these like crawlers that crawl the whole internet and scoop up information and data, and then they use that to train the models so that these large language models kind of know everything on the internet in order to kind of show that intelligence they have. Now, some companies like the New York Times, Reddit pushed back really hard and like, well, you can't just take our stuff and then you do well with it and make money, and like we're just left with nothing. So they carved out deals for them. They pay some of these like newspaper companies or Reddit some money in order to take the data. But there's a lot of data out there that just gets gobbled up, and whoever created that content may not even know it's happening, doesn't get any compensation whatsoever. So Cloudflare has like a unique way of addressing this, and this is still like really new and raw, and they don't even really know where this is going to go. But they have like a toggle setting where you can be like, no, you can't have my data, and then they have like, I think it's a new like default setting where it's like, no, you don't get to crawl this website. If you want to talk to them about, you know, purchasing it or whatever, like you can do that. And they're trying to come up with like a system, you know, to where you can basically agree to pay for that data. Obviously, eventually, some way this is going to get monetized both ways. The actual AI models are going to find new ways to make money. I would assume content creators outside of just, you know, the behemoth newspapers and Reddits of the world, YouTubes, whatever. Well, they're just for Google, as it turns out, but we'll find a way to make some money. It may not be a lot, but some money. Think of like Substack, where people like me will go write our thoughts and make a few bucks by people paying us for that content. But, you know, this can go just grab that data and use it and without you really realizing it, and they can make some money off of it. But if in this new system where Cloudflare can be like, yeah, not so fast, like you get into an environment where it makes sense for them to pay more content creators for good content to make their model better. And it makes sense for people to get something from that, since, you know, in a world of AI, content creators get less traffic. That's just, it is what it is. So almost like a way for everyone to win is to have some sort of like clearing system where both sides are making some money. And the reason this is interesting for Cloudflare is if they turn this into some sort of funnel toll road, and they take even a tiny fractional, you know, cut on doing this, intermediation between the two sides, you're talking about 20% of web traffic now. Imagine all of that getting this tiny little, you know, fractional payment to them for intermediating that. Obviously, that would be great for their revenue and their earnings. But also, if you think about it, if you're in the 80% that isn't going through Cloudflare, and you're like, hey, like I don't want these things crawling through my website either, so I'm gonna go join Cloudflare to make sure that I can get in on that, or I can get paid, you know, my couple bucks for them to look at my stuff. So I think you could have kind of a two-pronged thing where more people want to use Cloudflare to get this ability, and Cloudflare might be able to make some money on it. Now, you know, just because they have such a nice chunk of the internet to begin with, and they're already well respected for all the other things they do, they're really good, you know, with AI in other ways. They're good with edge computing in many ways. Like, they have a lot going for them, broadly speaking. So they you know, they're already kind of entrenched, but at the same time, there's nothing to say like someone else can't come along and build a similar system better and gain more scale than they do. So there's obviously no guarantee that they're the big winners in this, but it looks like they might at least be the first movers, especially with some size, to kind of do what feels like an obvious future intermediation between, you know, the AI model and the data the AI model is feeding on, essentially. I just thought that was interesting, and I owe a Stratechery for kind of highlighting this to a degree in one of their recent letters. It put it on my radar more than it already was, for sure. That's it for the two things I kind of really wanted to hit on.
The opinions expressed in this program are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or on any specific security. Any references to performance of securities are thought to be materially accurate, and actual performance may differ.
Obviously, yesterday we had CPI. Today we had PPI. PPI doesn't really include import prices, so you had a couple services items gap down pretty hard. Even though we did have goods inflation again inside of PPI, the services disinflation was hard enough to keep it lower than expected. So PPI still totally calm and cool, and I think it'll stay that way for a few months. I was a little surprised that CPI even caught the tariff inflation that it did this past month. And I still don't think that really gets big for another 1, 2, 3, 4 months. On the PPI side, I don't think you're going to see tariffs kind of overflow into PPI for 6+ months. So I wouldn't expect PPI to be significant. The producer prices, even though I think CPI is already, it's already showing you all right, I'm about to go up on goods inflation at least. And if you take those two together and you put them into what the Fed cares about for inflation measures of PCE, it looks like you're going to run on the high 0.2s, close to 0.3. It'll probably round up to 0.3 still, which is important because if you annualize that, you're talking, well up north of 3% inflation. And that's on the PCE, which is the one that the Fed cares more about than CPI. So this next PCE print it's not going to look good. And if you look at things like median and trim mean and inflation measures, some of the, frankly, more thoughtful ways of looking at it, a lot of those were just steadily coming down. And this last month, they perked back up a little bit. They started to curl. And those can be a little more goods heavy than CPI. A lot of things are. So I think you're going to see anything that trueflation, which a lot of people have been using lately, will be goods heavy. I think all of those things are all of a sudden going to curl up, the rest of the summer into the fall. And they're going to start showing inflation that's more like 3 than 2. Some measures more like 4 than 3, 4 than 2. And I think it's just going to become a bit of a problem, and one that would make the Fed kind of take the Fed off the table, whether or not Powell's running it and whether or not there's 1 or 2 new FOMC members. I think to get that whole committee, or I should say whole plurality of that committee, to back cutting rates into an inflation going back up, which will probably take inflation expectations back up, and all with wages coming down, really cheap oil prices, rents as well behaved as they've been really in a decade, if you really think about it. There's so much going for inflation right now, and it's 2.7%. There's no room for error because of the tariffs. You can argue hey, the tariffs themselves aren't going to be super inflationary, and that's not crazy. But what it does do, in my opinion, is it leaves you no room for error for things like oil. And at the same time, we're talking about putting sanctions on Russia and Iran over, geopolitical disagreements. You can't do that, because then you have energy inflation that combines with goods inflation, and you're 4 or 5% inflation, and obviously we can't deal with that right now. So you can read that a couple ways. One, it gets cut now, or you probably don't get to for a while, unless you change policy, really get rid of most of the tariffs. The other thing is, you may want to put real sanctions and tariffs, however you want to combine that, on somebody like Russia or Iran or both. But that's only a plausible thing if you're okay with $5 gasoline and 4 or 5% inflation, which is a political, just a giant political loser. There's another poll just came out. I think Marko Popic highlighted, and it shows it's a sort of a asking voters which one of these things you care about, which one's the most important, and everyone's still just pounding the table at inflation. That's what's important. So now you can ignore that and run inflation hot. and hope to still do okay in the midterms and still hold the White House 3.5 years from now. You can, but I'm not sure that would be a political winner. I think a lot of people really thought like this administration could do more to get inflation down, and if the $2 trillion in Doge cuts and we're going to balance the budget talk and all that had even if we just went that way 20%, let's say we got the deficit down to 4%, 5%, 4.5% of GDP, then you could have probably done that. And if you avoided big tariffs, like the Fed would have already cut rates, and weirdly enough, cutting rates would have helped bring down inflation, I think. But we've kind of gone the other direction with all this policy that's all been inflationary in my view. So the political ramifications around running not just the economy, but inflation pretty hot are going to get interesting. And you're already kind of in primary season for the midterms. So that'll be worth watching, as will the midterms themselves, before you know it somehow. And that will be an interesting sort of a scorecard for where you're heading 2 years from after that. And one thing I will say is like within the reconciliation bill, one of the clever things that was done was holding back on some of this stuff until after the midterms. Some of the stuff that, like the Medicaid cuts and everything that, are clearly going to be unpopular in a lot of communities, and could have an adverse impact on the economy as a whole. So, but my assumption is still the midterms are going to be a pretty big challenge for the GOP going in. But they may outperform expectations there. But if they do, where you're at going into the next presidential election is going to be interesting if inflation is running hot. Now, all these tariffs could go away literally with the stroke of a pen. And if inflation is running hot enough and they know that's where it came from, like the beauty of it from their standpoint is like they kind of have that lever they can pull to get inflation to whoosh down almost at any moment. So that's an interesting kind of way of looking at it. And you can almost view it as maybe if inflation gets hot enough that it's kind of obviously becoming a political problem, the odds that they pull that lever start getting higher as you go. And obviously if they pull that lever, like the market would be like, oh, here we go. Because you're going to, get inflation back down. You're going to get cuts, all that. So as inflation goes up, we'll price a bunch of these future cuts out. We might even price hikes in. And that would be the perfect time to kind of push back, fade it, go back the other way, knowing that, well, the chances are they're going to have to, get rid of a lot of these tariffs to undo the damage, the inflationary damage done. So just all, I don't know, something to think about as we move forward. But that's all I had today. We will be back tomorrow. We have retail sales tomorrow. We have home builder sentiment. So that's going to be big. And then the day after, even bigger to me, we have starts and permits, which is going to give us a little bit bigger, better view into the housing market. When I looked at today we're going to fire Powell and see that long end up 5 basis points. It's like, man, you're just going to club housing. If for no other reason, it's worth waiting to get to the next Fed chair, knowing that if you fire the current one, you're going to cripple housing. That's probably enough reason to just not do it. And maybe they agree and they launch the trial balloon and they're like, oh, nope, we're just not going to do that. We'll wait until next May. Anyways, that's it for me. We'll be back tomorrow. Don't forget, you can download and subscribe at knowyourriskpodcast.com. Check us out on YouTube so you can see that I'm sitting in front of Zach's stuff, because Inside Baseball, that's where the keyboard and the mouse is. We'll be back with more tomorrow. Check us out on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, InstaFace, Face page, all of it. That's where we're at. We'll be back tomorrow. Cheers.
Investment advice cannot be given without a client service agreement. Zach Abraham is an investment advisor representative of Trek Financial, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Bulwark Capital Management is a marketing name only and does not carry a separate registration.